My name is Vijay Iyengar. The name of my company is AgroCorp International. We have been in the pulses business for the last 33 years. So basically, pulses was my first business that I got involved in when I was working out of London. And I moved to Singapore in '86 and I've continued the business. Our first business for pulses was always from, we started from Canada in the good old days when Canadian yellow peas was called as number 2 century peas, and then we started emerging in Myanmar as well. So in the late 80s and early 90s, we were very active in Myanmar, exporting Myanmar pulses for perhaps the first time. I think if you look at all the news media, pulses has been identified as a superfood. And I think the challenge before the industry is to keep in with the status of superfood, make sure that we engage all the stakeholders in the business, including the manufacturers, the growers, the distributors, the traders, the brokers, and everybody in the supply chain to make sure that our industry achieves the levels that it's supposed to. Particularly if you look at what's happening all around you, you see more and more of the millennials looking at the pulse industry, looking at pulses as a consumption crop. And I think the scope of the industry is we have only tapped the surface of the scope, and there is a lot more to be done. And that's the task before a GPC and our committee. This year there is a new committee in place under the leadership of Cindy Brown. I've been nominated as the Executive Vice President, and I think there is a challenge before us to make sure that we represent the pulse industry in the right way, make sure that we propagate the right messages around the world, and allow the pulse industry to grow at the rate that it was growing a few years ago. If you look at what's happening in the pulse industry and the demand is driven by the millennials. So my son is a millennial as well. He's very excited to be part of this global pulse journey, particularly when it comprises of all the ingredients that pulses are producing, including the protein, the starch, and everything else that's emerging along the way. And I think that is what is keeping him engaged. And he's actually taken charge of our plants in Canada as well as Australia and Myanmar, and the pulses forms a very, very big portion of it. We've started a small pulse fractionation plant in Canada that he's also driving. So this is the agenda before him. The Singapore Pulse Federation was set up 3 years ago, mainly because if you look, more than 30 to 40% of the global pulse trade goes through Singapore as a trading hub. Practically all the stakeholders in the pulse industry are based in Singapore and operate out of Singapore in the region. And I think it's about time that an organization was set up to represent all the stakeholders in the pulse business. I think basically it's important for the industry to work with the Indian government. If you look at the Indian farm sector, the Indian farmers are among the poorest in the world. And it is in the interest of the government to make sure that the farmer's income is boosted, and at the same time they want to make sure that production is also maintained. So from the Indian government's perspective, they are riding something which is trying to balance the interests of the producer and the consumer. And I think as far as building up the buffer stock, it's very important that the Indian government does have a buffer stock. But at the same time, I think it's important for them to drive the consumers, drive consumption, and make sure that they have a long-term policy so that all the stakeholders in the business can work with them to make sure that whatever everybody's interest is safeguarded. See, basically, if you put yourself in the shoes of the Indian government, pulses is a sensitive food of national importance, and obviously they want to make sure that something like what happened 3 or 4 years ago is not repeated. 3 or 4 years ago, the prices in India skyrocketed, and global availability of pulses was also very thin. They want to make sure that they have sufficient availability of stocks of all kinds of pulses. It's not only the countries in South America that they have been engaging, they've also been engaging countries in Africa as well. India, the big challenge is, of course, government intervention, which affects all the stakeholders. But I'm optimistic that they will put together some kind of long-term policy which will help everybody in the business to be able to plan their involvement in the pulse sector. So that is something which the new government has just been elected, and I'm sure that they will put together something which will make it more of a long-term play. Because if you look at if you're an ingredient player, or if you're somebody who uses pulses to produce, say, protein or starch, or any of the other things that pulses are capable of producing, then you want a long-term policy before you. And I'm sure that the government will work this out, and I think it's something which is seizing their attention, and I'm sure that you will see something emerging along the way. Since the elections are over in India, I think the new government has sat down to work very fast. I'm sure that a new policy governing Indian agriculture will be put in place, and we are optimistic that the policy will be long-term in nature, so at least the immediate imposition of tariffs and short-term policy measures may not take place as they did in the past. So you might find that all the stakeholders in the pulse industry may get a long-term policy framework to work within. I think the GPC Symposium is really a place where the industry networks. All the new trends in the industry are highlighted. A lot of the supply and demand considerations which help decision making are also focused on. And in all, we find many different stakeholders present here. We get policy bodies like FAO, we get some of the UN bodies participating, we get governments from various countries participating. So really it's a great occasion for everybody in the pulse business to get together, understand the dynamics that drive the pulse business, and be present to be able to understand the full nature of the pulse industry, and to be able to put together their framework for the year ahead.